I need to tell someone about what happened on the Midnight Vista tour. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it all, though I doubt anyone will believe me. My name is Lou Kowalski, and I've been driving tour buses through the Rocky Mountains for 3 years now. Before this job, I was stuck in a cubicle in Denver, staring at spreadsheets and dreaming about the mountains I could see from my office window. When the opportunity came up to drive tours through Copper Ridge National Park, I jumped at it without hesitation. I love this job, or at least I used to. There's something magical about watching tourists experience the Rockies for the first time. The way their faces light up when they see their first wild elk, or how they go quiet with awe at the overlooks where you can see for 100 miles. The scenery never gets old. The fresh mountain air beats recycled office air any day. And even the tourists with their endless questions about wildlife and geology keep things interesting. I've driven every major route in the park system. The Alpine Loop with its 13,000-foot peaks. The wildlife safari route where we regularly spot bears and mountain goats. The historic mining trail that takes you past ghost towns and abandoned silver mines. I know these roads like the back of my hand, know exactly where to stop for the best photos, which stories make the tourists laugh, and how to handle everything from altitude sickness to tourist meltdowns. But after last weekend, I'm not sure I can keep doing this. Hell, I'm not sure I'm even the same person who started this job 3 years ago. It started when my supervisor, Mr. Garrett, called me into his office Friday afternoon. I'd just finished the afternoon wildlife safari tour. A good group saw 2 black bears and a golden eagle, and was looking forward to a quiet weekend. Garrett had been my supervisor since I started, and he was normally a pretty casual guy, the kind of boss who'd rather talk about fishing than paperwork, who trusted his drivers to know their jobs. But that day, he looked serious, worried even, the kind of expression you see on someone's face when they're about to deliver bad news. "Lou, I've got a new route for you," he said, sliding a manila envelope across his scratched wooden desk. The envelope looked old, like it had been handled by many people over many years. The Midnight Vista Tour. I'd never heard of it, and that was strange. In 3 years of driving every scenic route in Copper Ridge National Park, that name had never come up. Not in training materials, not in casual conversation with other drivers, not even on the master schedule board in the break room. "Is it new?" I asked, picking up the envelope. It felt heavier than it should have. "Something like that." He tapped the envelope with his finger, and I noticed his hand was trembling slightly. "There are specific rules for this route, Lou. Follow them exactly as written. No deviations, no exceptions, no improvisations." I laughed, thinking he was being overly dramatic about some new safety protocol. "Come on, Mr. Garrett. What kind of rules? Drive the speed limit, keep the bathroom clean, don't let tourists feed the wildlife?" His expression didn't change. If anything, he looked more serious. "Open it when you get to your bus. Read them carefully. Follow them exactly. And Lou," he paused, meeting my eyes with an intensity I'd never seen from him before. "If something feels wrong, if your instincts tell you to deviate from the rules, ignore those instincts. The rules exist for a reason." As I left his office, I noticed something odd. The other drivers in the break room, guys I'd worked with for years, shared beers with after long shifts, complained about difficult tourists with. They were all watching me, but when I made eye contact with any of them, they all suddenly found something else to look at. Tom pretended to be fascinated by his coffee cup. Steve started rifling through paperwork he'd already organized. Even Rachel, who usually had something sarcastic to say about everything, just stared at the wall. That should have been my first warning. I got to my assigned bus around 7 o'clock that evening, giving myself extra time to do the pre-trip inspection and review whatever strange rules Garrett had given me. Bus 47 was one of the newer vehicles in our fleet, a comfortable 40-passenger coach with good suspension and reliable heating, important for mountain driving. The Midnight Vista Tour was scheduled to depart at 7:30, which seemed like an odd time for a scenic tour. Most evening tours departed around 6 to catch the sunset from the high overlooks. But I'd driven sunset tours before, and full moon tours weren't unheard of. Sometimes the nighttime mountain experience was more dramatic than the daytime version. Different wildlife, different atmosphere, different kinds of photos for the tourists to take back home. The envelope sat on my dashboard like it weighed 50 pounds. I kept glancing at it while I checked tire pressure, fluid levels, and emergency equipment. Finally, after I'd run out of other tasks to distract myself, I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, with 8 rules written in careful handwriting. Not typed, handwritten, like someone had sat down with a pen and carefully considered each word. Never make eye contact with passengers in seats 7A and 7B between miles 15 to 23. If someone asks about the singing trees, tell them it's just wind. Do not stop at Deer Creek Overlook if the parking area is completely empty. If a passenger claims they see lights moving in the forest, turn up the radio immediately. Never count the passengers after mile 30. If asked about previous tours on this route, say this is the first one. Keep the interior lights dim after sunset. Do not acknowledge any tapping sounds from the luggage compartment. I read the list 3 times, waiting for the punchline or some kind of explanation. This had to be some kind of elaborate hazing ritual for new routes. The veteran drivers were probably watching from the office windows, waiting to see my reaction. Maybe there was a hidden camera somewhere, and this would be the story they'd tell at the company Christmas party. But the more I read the rules, the less they seemed like a joke. They were too specific, too detailed. Rule number 1 mentioned exact seat numbers and mile markers. Rule number 3 referenced a specific location. These weren't generic safety guidelines. They were instructions for handling very particular situations. Situations that someone had apparently encountered before. When I looked up from the paper, the parking lot was filling with passengers. I counted them as they approached. 18 people total, which was a good size group for an evening tour. There was a mix of elderly couples wearing matching windbreakers and sensible walking shoes. Some young hikers in their 20s with expensive cameras and GPS watches. A family with twin boys who looked about 10 years old, and a woman traveling alone. All perfectly normal tourists, excited about their evening adventure in the Rocky Mountains. "Welcome aboard the Midnight Vista Tour," I announced as they filed onto the bus, putting on my usual cheerful driver persona. I'm Lou, and I'll be your driver and guide tonight. We'll be heading up into the high country to catch some spectacular views under the full moon. The forecast is clear, so we should have excellent visibility all the way to the Continental Divide. Everyone seemed cheerful enough as they found their seats, chatting about the day's activities and expressing excitement about the nighttime mountain experience. I made my usual safety announcements: seatbelts, emergency exits, how the bathroom worked, what to do if someone felt altitude sickness. Standard stuff I'd done hundreds of times before. The couple that had taken seats 7A and 7B were probably in their 70s, grey-haired, well-dressed, the kind of people who take a lot of tours and know exactly how everything works. The woman wore a pearl necklace and a cardigan, despite the warm evening, while the man had on a pressed shirt and slacks that looked too formal for a mountain tour. They sat very still with their hands folded in their laps, staring straight ahead at the seat backs in front of them. Some tourists were like that, quiet, reserved, more interested in observing than participating. I didn't think much of it at the time. We pulled out of the visitor center at exactly 7:30. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that made the passengers pull out their cameras and phones. The first 14 miles were completely normal, exactly like hundreds of other tours I'd driven. I gave my usual commentary about the local wildlife, pointed out geological features carved by ancient glaciers, shared some park history and stories about the original homesteaders. The passengers asked the typical questions: how high are we now? What kind of trees are those? Do you ever see bears on this route? Have you lived in Colorado your whole life? The twin boys wanted to know if we might see any wolves, and I explained that while wolves had been reintroduced to some parts of Colorado, they weren't common in this particular area. Everything felt normal, routine, exactly like any other tour. But as we approached mile 15, something began to feel different. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the atmosphere inside the bus. The conversations became quieter. The passengers stopped taking as many photos and started looking around more nervously. And the couple in seats 7A and 7B hadn't moved or spoken since boarding the bus, not even to look out the windows at the spectacular scenery we were passing. They just sat there, perfectly still, hands folded, staring at the seat backs in front of them, like they were watching the most fascinating movie ever made. Other passengers had started to notice too. I could hear whispered conversations behind me. Are those people okay? They haven't moved at all. Maybe they're sleeping, with their eyes open. Should we check on them? I found myself wanting to turn around and check on them, make sure they were okay, maybe ask if they needed anything. But rule number 1 flashed in my mind. Never make eye contact with passengers in seats 7A and 7B between miles 15 to 23. It was probably nothing. Some people just weren't chatty on tours. Some folks preferred to experience the mountains quietly, without a lot of social interaction. I'd had passengers before who barely said a word the entire trip but left excellent reviews afterward. I kept my eyes on the winding mountain road and continued my commentary, but I could hear other passengers whispering about the statue people behind them. The twin boys kept glancing back nervously, and their mother had started holding them closer to her side of the bus. Around mile 20, one of the boys raised his hand. "Mr. Lu, what's that pretty music?" I listened carefully. At first, all I could hear were the normal mountain sounds: wind through the trees, the bus engine, distant water running over rocks. But then I caught it, a melodic sound drifting through the trees, hauntingly beautiful, like voices singing in harmony. But there were no words I could understand, no melody I recognized. It seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, surrounding us as we climbed higher into the mountains. "That's just the wind blowing through the pine trees," I said quickly, remembering rule number 2. The branches and needles create different tones depending on the wind speed and direction. It's a common acoustic phenomenon in mountain forests. The boy looked skeptical. "It sounds like people singing." "Mountain acoustics can play tricks on you," I assured him, though the sound really did seem unusually musical for wind. Too organized, too harmonious. The shape of the valleys and rock formations can amplify and distort sounds in interesting ways. Wait until you hear the echo at Eagle's Rest Overlook. You can shout and hear your voice bounce around the canyon for 15 seconds. But even as I gave this rational explanation, I was listening more carefully to the sound. It was definitely melodic, definitely organized, and it seemed to be getting stronger as we climbed higher, as if we were approaching its source. We continued climbing into the high country. The full moon was rising over the eastern peaks, casting everything in silver light that made the forest look ethereal and otherworldly. Under different circumstances, it would have been breathtakingly beautiful. The kind of scene that made people understand why I'd left my office job to drive tours through these mountains. But something felt wrong. The singing continued, growing more complex, more layered, and the couple in 7A and 7B remained absolutely motionless. At mile 26, we reached Deer Creek Overlook. It was one of the most popular stops on the mountain routes, a large parking area with spectacular views of the valley below, perfect for photos and wildlife spotting. On clear nights like this, you could see the lights of 3 different towns spread out across the valley floor, and the view of the Milky Way was incredible. But as we approached, I saw the parking area was completely empty. Not a single car, not even any evidence that anyone had been there recently. No tire tracks in the gravel, no litter, no sign of human activity at all. That was strange, really strange. Weekend nights usually brought out photographers trying to capture the perfect moonlit landscape, astronomy enthusiasts with their telescopes, and young couples looking for romantic spots. Deer Creek Overlook was famous throughout the region for its nighttime views. It should have had at least a few cars, especially on such a clear night with a full moon. But rule number 3 was clear. Do not stop at Deer Creek Overlook if the parking area is completely empty. "Folks, we're going to skip this overlook and head up to the next one," I announced, keeping the bus moving past the empty parking area. "Better views up there anyway, and we'll have more room to spread out for photos." Several passengers groaned in disappointment. "Come on, driver," called out one of the hikers, a young woman with an expensive camera hanging around her neck. "Just a quick photo stop. The moonlight on the valley looks incredible." "Sorry, but the next overlook has much better sight lines," I insisted, pressing slightly harder on the accelerator. "Trust me, you'll get better shots up there." But this is the famous Deer Creek Overlook, protested one of the elderly tourists. I've been reading about it online for months. The next stop will be worth the wait, I promised, though I had no idea which overlook we'd reach next, or whether it would actually have better views. In my peripheral vision, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The couple in 7A and 7B had turned their heads slightly toward the empty overlook as we passed. It was the first movement I'd seen from them all evening, and there was something wrong about the way they'd done it. Too synchronized, too mechanical, like mannequins being moved by the same puppeteer. A few minutes later, the family with twins got excited about something outside their window. "Look at all the fireflies," the mother called out. "Boys, come see this. I've never seen so many in one place." I glanced towards the forest and my breath caught in my throat. There were lights moving between the trees, dozens of them, bright and pulsing in coordinated patterns. But they were too bright to be fireflies, too large, too organized. They moved in formations, like they were communicating with each other or following some kind of plan. "Dancing lights," one of the twins exclaimed, pressing his face against the window. "Mom, they're following the bus." Rule number 4 kicked in immediately. I reached over and turned up the radio, filling the bus with classic rock music. The sudden, loud music made several passengers jump, but I kept it loud enough to make conversation difficult. "Just a natural phenomenon," I called out over the music. Atmospheric conditions in the mountains can create optical illusions, especially on clear nights like this. Reflection of moisture in the air, temperature inversions, that sort of thing. But even as I gave this explanation, I couldn't stop stealing glances at those lights. They were definitely moving parallel to the bus, keeping pace with us as we climbed the mountain road. When we took a sharp turn, they adjusted their path to follow. When we slowed down for a steep section, they slowed down too. These were not atmospheric conditions or optical illusions. The singing from the forest grew louder, more complex, easily audible now over the radio. Other passengers were starting to notice it, looking around nervously and asking questions I pretended not to hear over the music. We passed mile 30, and I realized I'd been unconsciously counting passengers throughout the tour. It was a habit from my training. Always keep track of your people. Make sure no one gets left behind at stops. Know exactly who you're responsible for. We'd started with 18, and I'd been checking periodically to make sure everyone was accounted for. But rule number 5 said never count the passengers after mile 30. Why would that matter? What difference would it make? I couldn't help myself. Even knowing I shouldn't, even remembering the rule, I did a quick head count in my rearview mirror. The interior lights were dim as instructed, making it hard to see clearly, but I could make out the general shapes of my passengers. 18 people, just like before. But something felt wrong. The numbers added up, but something about the count felt off. I tried again, more carefully this time, starting from the front and working my way back. 2 elderly couples in the front rows, the hikers in the middle section, the family with twins on the left side, the woman traveling alone near the back. 19. There was someone sitting in the aisle near the back of the bus, in the shadows where the dim lighting barely reached. I tried to focus on them, to figure out who they were and why they weren't in a proper seat. But every time I looked directly, my vision seemed to slide away. like trying to look at something in your peripheral vision that disappears when you turn your head toward it. A rhythmic tapping started coming from below, from the luggage compartment under the bus. Not random knocking or the sound of loose equipment, but a deliberate pattern. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. Like someone down there was trying to communicate, trying to send a message in some kind of code. The woman traveling alone suddenly stood up and walked toward the front of the bus. She moved with an odd, gliding gait that didn't quite match the movement of the bus on the winding road. Other passengers had to grip their armrests to keep balanced, but she seemed unaffected by the swaying and bouncing. "Excuse me, driver? How long have you been running tours on this route?" she asked, standing right beside my seat. Up close, I could see that something was wrong with her appearance. Her skin was too pale in the dim light, almost translucent. And when she smiled, her teeth seemed too sharp, too many. Rule number 6. If asked about previous tours on this route, say this is the first one. "This is actually the first time we're running the Midnight Vista Tour," I lied, keeping my eyes on the road ahead. "It's a new addition to our schedule." "That's interesting," she said, her voice like honey poured over broken glass. "Because I could swear I've taken this exact tour before. Same route, same stops, same." She paused, glancing meaningfully toward seats 7A and 7B. Same passengers. The couple was still sitting motionless, but now their stillness felt sinister rather than just odd. In the dim light, they looked less like elderly tourists and more like something else wearing human shapes. The tapping from below grew louder, more insistent. The rhythmic pattern became more complex, more urgent. Other passengers were starting to notice it now, looking around nervously and whispering to each other. "What's that noise?" asked one of the elderly passengers, an old man in a fishing vest who'd been asking questions about wildlife all evening. I kept my eyes on the road, following rule number 8. Probably just something loose in the cargo area. I'll check it when we stop. But the tapping continued, becoming more frantic, more desperate. It sounded less like something loose and more like someone trapped, desperately trying to get out. The sound echoed through the floor of the bus, making the whole vehicle seem to vibrate with each impact. The twin boys had gone very quiet, both staring at seats 7A and 7B with wide, frightened eyes. Their mother noticed their behavior and followed their gaze. I heard her sharp intake of breath, saw her pulling her children closer to her. "Those people," she whispered to her husband, loud enough for me to hear over the radio. "There's something wrong with them." I couldn't help myself. Rule or no rule, I had to look. I had to know what was happening on my bus. Rule number 1 said, never make eye contact with passengers in seats 7A and 7B between miles 15 to 23. We were well past mile 30 now. Technically, the rule didn't apply anymore. I adjusted my rearview mirror and looked directly at the elderly couple. They weren't elderly. They weren't even human. Their faces were smooth and featureless, like mannequins that hadn't been finished. But their eyes were black pools that reflected the dim interior lights like mirrors. As I watched in horror, they both turned their heads in perfect unison to look directly back at me. Their necks rotated too far, too smoothly, in ways that human anatomy shouldn't allow. That's when everything went wrong at once. The forest lights outside suddenly blazed brighter, moving toward the bus in organized formations, like an army advancing on a target. The singing from the trees became clearly audible over the radio, not wind through branches, but inhuman voices calling out in a language that made my ears hurt to hear. The tapping from the luggage compartment turned into violent pounding, as if something large and powerful was trying to break free. The entire bus shook with each impact, the floor buckling upward with the force of whatever was trapped below. And the 19th passenger in the aisle became fully visible. A young woman in clothes from decades ago, her face pale and desperate, her mouth moving as she tried to say something I couldn't hear over the chaos. The other passengers were screaming now, some pressed against the windows, trying to get away from the things in 7A and 7B. Others huddled in their seats, covering their children's eyes. The twin boys were crying, their parents trying to shield them from whatever was happening around us. The entities in seats 7A and 7B rose from their seats in one fluid motion, moving in ways that human joints shouldn't allow. Their limbs bent at impossible angles as they turned toward the terrified passengers, their featureless faces somehow conveying malevolent hunger. I had a choice to make, and I had to make it fast. Follow the remaining rules and hope we'd all survive whatever this was, or break them all to try to save everyone on the bus. I chose my passengers. I flipped on all the interior lights, flooding the bus with harsh fluorescence. The entities recoiled from the brightness, making sounds like nails dragged across glass. I stomped on the accelerator, sending the bus racing down the mountain road faster than was safe. But safety had become a relative concept. The lights in the forest converged on us, keeping pace despite our speed. In my mirrors, I could see shapes moving between the trees, tall, wrong shapes that hurt to look at directly, that made my eyes water and my head pound. The pounding from below reached a crescendo, and I heard something break, metal tearing, bolts snapping. But instead of whatever was trapped down there getting loose and making things worse, something unexpected happened. The 19th passenger suddenly became solid, substantial. She rushed toward the back of the bus, her ghostly hands somehow holding back the entities in 7A and 7B. I could hear her voice now, clear and strong despite the chaos. "Drive," she shouted. "Get to the boundary. Dawn is coming." I pushed the bus harder than I'd ever pushed any vehicle. The engine screamed in protest as we took hairpin turns at dangerous speeds, tires squealing in the asphalt. Behind us, the supernatural chaos grew more intense. The things outside were howling now, a sound that made my bones ache and my vision blur. But ahead, I could see the first pale glow of dawn starting to touch the eastern peaks. And there, finally visible around the next bend, was the park boundary sign, the line between the supernatural hunting ground we'd entered and the normal world beyond. We crossed the line just as the sun crested the mountains, flooding the valley with golden morning light. Everything stopped. The lights in the forest vanished instantly. The howling cut off mid-note. The pounding from below went silent. When I looked in my rearview mirror, seats 7A and 7B were empty, and there were only 18 passengers on the bus again. The 19th passenger, the woman who had helped us, who had held back the entities with her ghostly hands, was gone. I got everyone safely back to the visitor center, though it took me 20 minutes to stop my hands from shaking enough to park the bus properly. The strange thing was, none of the passengers seemed to remember exactly what had happened. They talked about a rough ride and weird lighting effects, but the supernatural elements seemed to have faded from their memories, like a half-remembered nightmare. Mr. Garrett was waiting for me in the parking lot. He looked relieved when he saw the bus pull in intact, like he'd been genuinely worried about whether I'd make it back. "How did it go?" he asked. "The rules," I said, my voice still shaky. "Why didn't you tell me what would happen if I broke them?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. "Because drivers who know too much ahead of time don't come back. The rules aren't arbitrary, Lou. They're survival instructions, developed over years of experience with that route." Experience? How long has this been going on? Longer than either of us has worked here. Longer than this park has been officially open. He handed me another manila envelope, just as worn and handled as the first one. "Your next midnight Vista tour is scheduled for this weekend." I stared at the envelope like it was a venomous snake. "You can't be serious." "Open it." Inside was a new list of rules. The original 8 were still there, but now there were additional ones. Never make eye contact with the driver in the rearview mirror if his reflection doesn't match his movements. If passengers complain about feeling cold despite the heater running, do not acknowledge their discomfort. Do not trust any passenger who claims to recognize you from a previous tour. My hands were shaking as I read rule number 9 again. What did that mean? What was supposed to happen to drivers who broke the rules? What had happened to me during that ride through the supernatural chaos? I looked up at Mr. Garrett, but he was already walking away. "Garrett, wait," I called after him. He stopped but didn't turn around. "Yeah, Lou?" "What if I don't want to do another tour?" "Then someone else will have to. And they'll go in without any preparation at all." He finally looked back at me, and his expression was sympathetic but firm. "You survived your first time. That makes you valuable. Most drivers don't make it past their third tour. What happens to the ones who don't make it?" But he was already walking away, leaving me alone in the parking lot with a bus full of confused tourists and a manila envelope full of rules I was afraid to understand. That was 2 weeks ago. I've done 2 more Midnight Vista tours since then. Each time, the rules list gets longer. Each time, I notice new things about myself that seem off. Sometimes, my reflection in the mirror moves a split second after I do. Sometimes, I catch myself humming melodies that sound suspiciously like the singing from the trees. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm trying to sleep, I hear tapping sounds coming from my apartment walls. The most disturbing thing is that I'm getting better at the job. The supernatural elements don't frighten me as much anymore. I handle the rules violations with increasing calm, like I'm becoming part of the system rather than just someone trying to survive it. I'm scheduled for another tour this weekend. The envelope is sitting on my kitchen table, and I haven't opened it yet. I know there will be new rules adapted from whatever happened on my last trip. The system learns, evolves, adds protections based on each driver's experience. But I'm starting to wonder, what happens when you follow the rules so many times that you become part of whatever they're designed to protect against. What happens when the job changes you so much that you're no longer entirely human? I guess I'll find out this weekend. If you're ever offered a job driving tour buses in the mountains and someone hands you a list of strange rules, my advice is simple. Find another job. Some routes aren't meant for people who want to stay human. But if you do take the job, follow the rules exactly. Your life and the lives of your passengers depend on it. Trust me on this one. I'm still mostly human enough to know the difference.